importance of ownership, especially for people of color, how it has maybe changed over the years, and why it is especially important now. So I'll start with you, Mr. Coates.
I probably have a limited type of approach to this, because almost everything to me is about like balance. Like, I think it's right. Like it isn't a question of whether we should have ownership, whether we shouldn't have ownership. To be in balance, that's the norm. And I want to be about the norm. Like stories about Black folks and the way we come through our history, why should not there be Black publishing companies to publish that? Why should there only be, again, to my knowledge, only one company that prints books, Black-owned company that prints books? Do y'all hear what I'm saying? I'm saying every book that you have in this school, every book that you will go into the bookstore and buy was printed by primarily a white company or a Chinese company. Think about that. No African Americans, no participation. Why is that? So for me, the idea of ownership, particularly economically that we're speaking, is a norm. And it should be the norm that we work to. As Black people, it should be the norm that's supported by society if you are normal. That's my limited.
Councilman Lavelle.
I have a distinct opportunity to open up doors for others. Owning your own message, I think it's necessary. Only because too often the voices of many don't get heard. So my colleagues and I, my partners and I, put together a package plan to entertain the world with our point of view. It comes off a little comedic at times, but the dialogue has to do with the dialogue that we own. It's a perspective of our community. It's a perspective of many lives that are facing the same thing that we do. So it's necessary for us to own it, because in owning it, we own the responsibility, the obligation, how it's steered, who gets it, and then the outcome of it. Too often we've allowed too many individuals to determine our path. Too many individuals to determine how far we can go. Could you imagine the wonderful opportunities, the greatness that could have come about if there were no limits on the mind? If there's no limits in the inspiration in a small child of color? Imagine the greatness that we could have achieved here in this wonderful country if we had equal rights to our own thoughts. So I am obligated, in my point of view, to not only own my message, but to help others who own their own message get heard. So I think it's necessary.
First, I want to thank Mr. Coates for a wonderful, inspiring presentation. Like you, I sometimes think I know a whole lot, but you taught me things today that I really didn't know about, and I really do appreciate that. And I couldn't help but relate your story to my own story. When you ask yourself, what can you do, what should you do, etc. And I often say I'm a child of the 60s. And one of the things I was a teenager during the 60s, and it was at the time when it was in the midst of the Civil Rights Black Power movement. And I listened to the radio all the time, and Gil Scott-Heron was one of my favorite people, and he sang about the revolution will not be televised. And as a 16, 17-year-old, I actually thought the revolution was coming. And so I was waiting for the revolution. I was preparing. I knew the revolution would probably be, in North Philadelphia. I'm from Philly as well. And I thought people would take to the streets, and I wanted to make sure I had car fare and all that to get up to the streets to riot in North Philadelphia. So the revolution didn't come, and I was somewhat disappointed. But it still left me with the question, what am I supposed to do? And as you know from the earlier presentation, I was trained as a dancer. And one of the things that occurred to me when I moved to a suburban community is where were all the Black art centers? Where were the schools for Black kids? Did we have control anymore of training in the arts, etc.? And so at the age of 21 or so, I thought, I'm gonna establish a black dance school, black performing arts company, because our community has to have this. We have to be in control of this. We have to inspire young people. And in the last 46 years, one of the rewards is looking at young people and saying, them saying to me, I didn't know who I was until I got here. And so I think the thing about space and ownership is important. And even though I established it as a nonprofit instead of profit-making kind of institution, I thought it was critically important that anybody with any kind of skill, talent, ability create things for their own community. And that's one of the things that I was able to do. And I certainly hope I can continue to do it for a while.
Thank you. Councilman Delgado, I want to start with you on this one. I know with your experience in Atlantic City, I'm sure Ms. Hamer's spirit rides with you pretty much every single day. This idea of intellectual resistance, or just resistance in general, in terms of activism, the activism that is of today is not the activism that was of the 20s or 30s or 50s, 60s, 70s. Where do you see activism going today? And what are the ways in which we can engage in this resistance to improve our livelihood, to improve not only the spaces in which we occupy, but our intellectual growth?
I think it's extremely important to understand that activism takes effort. Because too often we claim ourselves to be activists, but we assume more than we activate or become active in doing anything. Too often the people that we assume are leaders are just there navigating through their own lives and their own abilities and how they can progress. So instead of assuming, we need to be active ourselves. Being a community activist or an activist of social change takes a lot of effort, takes thought, and it also takes allies. You need to build allies to move forward. The black community has been extremely empowered by its own endeavors. But it also has solidified some movement and some activities because of the allies that helped along the way. My community, or the Latino community, or black Latinos as we are so enamored in considering, we've had to navigate both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So we've had to navigate through those understandings, those perceptions, to try to motivate individuals to understand that our hardships are shared. It's not one that's exclusively for one grouping, but it's one that impacts the entire community. And then having that being said, it's one that affects or impacts the entire community. Because as they say, ignorance and any kind of hardship suffered by one has a penalty upon all assault. So its activism is necessary. And I think that the young people today have more of an opportunity to be more widespread. Social media, of course, that's what I'm using right now. Say hi, everybody. Social media gives us a platform that we didn't have, or Elder Coates had in his time. It took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, knocking on doors, a lot of slamming in the face, a lot of buckets of water, a lot of that. And some of us now are benefiting from those hard efforts of those years before. We are obligated as activists or people that care to take those reins now, utilizing the tools and technology that we have now, and move forward. We can't continuously sit back on our laurels and say, we've gotten this far. We've got so much more to accomplish, so much more to do, but it takes effort. But it also takes understanding, because if it wasn't for Elder Coates, the sister to the left of me, who's an amazing individual, working in the field that she does, in social work, I'm also a social worker, so I got lots of love. I got lots of love. We have to respect each other's lane. We know, we find the lane, and we respect that lane, and empower one another, encourage one another, keep motivating, replenishing those resources and needs that we need to move forward. And then we'll make it easier for Elder Coates to sit back and relax and say, I did it for something. Because too often, there's elders like him who sit back and say, where did I go wrong? And we are obligated to do right. So being active, we're obligated. It's an obligation that we must continually hold hard in our hearts and push forward. There is no turning back once you open your eyes.
Hey, can I just pick up on that? Because one of the questions I want us to consider is, how do you be a social activist, or how do you encourage the mind, how do you encourage intellectualism, et cetera, in this current age of advanced technology? More specifically, and I would ask Mr. Coates this too, I would ask, are people still willing to read? Are books as relevant as they used to be? I sometimes find it a little bit astonishing interacting with some Stockton students, none here, but some Stockton students, when you talk about you need to buy a book or acquire a book, it's always like, well, can I just read something on the internet or whatever the case may be? And so where are we right now in regards to, and I know as far as commercial sales of books, et cetera, it has really been in a state of decline. I mean, you look at the major white bookstores that have gone under because people are not as interested as they used to be in the past with books or with reading. You know, where does that take us? I think most people want the short version of everything, you know, the real short version. So, how are we gonna stimulate the mind if the books aren't there like they used to be? And Paul, that's for you.
Sure. And this is interesting because my response to you really overlaps with my response to the initial question. And again, I'm feeling very limited up here. But look, if you talk about activism, if you talk about going forward, I'm gonna go to Booker T. Washington. You know, like Booker T. Washington talk about Uncle Tom, so one of the most radical black men ever. And Booker T. Washington said, "Throw down your buckets where you are." You know, throw down your buckets where you are. Look, so I'm thinking about activism the way I've always thought about activism. You know, it's grounded in something. So the game is to understand that there's a history before you decided you wanted to be an activist, and plug into that history. Plug into that history by reading, plug into that history by finding out what went before you. And again, this is backwards toward Dr. Reed Mary. There are histories of people who have preceded you, and you've got to plug into those histories while in fact you do what Brother Delgado said here, while you still take action. So I think it's a combination. I think you've got to be in action, but you also want to do the study. No study, you don't have the right to, you know, jump to the front of the line. It's got that, no investigation, no right to speak, one of those type of things. In terms of what Dr. Reed Merritt's question is about books, I don't know. I just find an explosion of people reading, and I have to be honest with you, Pat, I don't know if more people read in the past than are reading now. Because to me, there was always this group of people who loved reading, and would go out of their way to read. And there was always this group of people who didn't like reading and go out of their way not to read. I don't know if that group has gotten bigger, because we are affected by reading and information on so many different levels. One level that operates here, and it's operating right now, and I've lived long enough to know this, is that there are people in this audience that are sitting here right now that are hearing this discussion, and this discussion is penetrating on a level that will kick off at some point in the future, and they will begin reading about what's being talked about here. You're probably sitting there not even thinking that that's you. But trust me, it works on you like that, and it will work on you. So reading begins even in this space with a discussion like this. And again, my gratitude to the school and to the administration here, Dr. Kesselman and others, but even having a discussion like this.
I think if I add my 2 cents about the society today, I think society is being molded by popular thought. Popular thought sometimes doesn't give enough patience for a reason. Everything has to be done 140 characters, everything has to be done with a GIF JPEG, or meme. And misunderstandings come about so widely that we become a detached and a disassociated society. Disassociated. We have people who more communicate online in front of a phone more than they can in person. Reading is essentially something that's intrinsic, something that goes inside your body and your mind. You have to really formulate these thought processes in your brain.
Yeah.
It helps to develop the brain. Society today is dumbing us down. They would rather you not create anything in your mind. They'd rather you and see the interpretation of someone else and give it to you in a nice little package saying, forward this, or like this, or follow this. When we should be following and reading and filling up our books. In my home, I treasure my library. I've had a library of 100 books that was given when I was studying at Kane University or Kane College back in the day. Dr. Barbara Wheeler gave me a list, and she said, if you don't get these books, I'm coming to haunt you. And Elder taught me to get these books. I made sure I got these books, and I'm still hunting for some of the most amazing and rare books still to this day. And I try to impart that with my son and all the children that I've come in contact with. It's a physical element that you touch. You actually get to see and touch something that someone else took some blood, sweat, and tears to formulate an idea, a conscious thought, to put in form, a legitimate verbal form that you can read and share with. You can't do that on your phone per se. Although we can sit up there and look at our speeches and look at different contexts of what we can on a small little diagram, but the endless amount of pixels in our brain, the endless amount of concepts that we can formulate based on the words, the literary words, the engagements, the adventures that they presented or provided for us, way surpasses anything that Apple, Samsung, or any of these amazing technology companies could ever even fathom to build. And they're still striving to try to match us. When Imhotep and the rest of these ancient Egyptians, back in the ancient times, determined what they needed to do, they're still trying to figure out how to write down code to match that, when what they wrote was on the walls telling you, this is what you need to read. So as we go on forward and we're learning languages like code and learning languages like popular concepts and context of media and what have you, and then the different forms of language that we're starting to convert. English no longer is the same old English as I spoke in the early 80s as we do now in the year 2019. Language continues to evolve. The language of the mind is something that's still concrete. And as long as we have books, we can revert back to the mindset of those individuals that wrote it. That's how we are able to follow their path. It's necessary for us to follow their path, because when we know the lives that they've lived and the hardships that they've had already succumbed, or they've already surpassed and be victorious from, then we're able to build from there. We're able to encompass what it is that we need to do now. So it's essential, it's necessary. So instead of picking up your phone, let's go out and get a book.
Beautiful, beautiful, bravo.
I want to jump to the audience and see if there's any. I want to leave at least a time for one or two questions. If there's any pressing question from the audience for any of our panelists before we go and enjoy the reception, you can please raise your hand and I'll see if
I have a question.
I can see you. Yes, sir.
I'll use my outside voice. Reverend Stafford Miller, clergy. In reference to the Black Panther Party and prison, the criminal injustice system, and again I say the injustice system, they say it's broken. But I want to say that it's functioning the way they want it to function. It's not broken at all. So your response to that, and also to the Black Panther Party, was it a moment or was it a movement? Was it an event or is it still going on? And as a clergy person, I can always speak to the heart as well as the head. We have 1,000 universities, we have more brilliant minds in Washington, D.C., yet we're still a very broken people. So with all the folks you shared, I'm sure there was something going on within them that gave them the fuel and the moral compass not to give up. So your response.
I'll try to do the best I can with it. But let me say this just as context. You don't really have a Black Panther Party in this country without the church. I want folks to get present for that. You don't have a Black Panther Party without the church. The Panthers largely were atheists, okay? Largely they were atheists because most of them were communists and most of them dealt with the proposition that God was dead. But they dealt across the country with congregations, pastors, church groups that embraced them regardless of what they thought. They embraced them because the mission was similar and the mission was directed. So all those breakfast programs, almost all those breakfast programs were in the churches. The church really supported the Panthers and the Panthers dealt with those folks. Just quickly, I imagine it was a moment in a movement, the Panther Party, a moment in a movement, just like everything else in our history shows up as a movement in a moment. Nat Turner is a movement in a moment. David Walker is a movement in a moment. The Black Panther Party was a response to conditions at that particular time. They were tied into a history that came out of another history. And so they were a moment, and they left an indelible impression that others can learn from and live with as they go along. So I think a moment of movement is an appropriate way to look at them contextually.
Any other, one more audience question? Just raise your hand. I have the light directly in my eye right here. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming today. I'm very interested in how you feel the book continues to play a role or a lack of a role in the current, as the pastor said, injustice.
I'm sorry, the book?
The book.
The book. You know, I think Brother Delgado really, I don't know that I could do better than him. I really don't know that I could do better than him. You know, I really don't. I will say this, I think that that's all of us, have a responsibility to the book. You know, so I don't know about the book, but you know, it is a thing to us, but we have a responsibility to the book. We have a response, and I may be a little bit different because, look, so I deal with the book electronically, you know what I mean? I deal with the book in audio form, and if they come out in some other form, I'll deal with that too. So all of that is the book to me. I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we support authors who are out here, authors that don't necessarily have the popularity of Ta-Nehisi. I think we have the responsibility to support people who are doing research that will lead into books. And then we have the responsibility, much in the way that Dr. Reed Merritt has done, to tell our stories. To tell the stories that we know. She's done many books, but she knew intimately the history of the National Association of Black Social Workers, one of the more important groups in our history, our recent history here. So I think we have a responsibility to the book, and I know that may not answer your question directly, but you know, that's the best I got.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all who are here for staying. We have two things going on. We have on the lower level right outside the PAC, there are some books from Black Classic Press that are on display and open for purchase. And then upstairs, upper level, we have a reception and you can meet our wonderful speaker and our panelists. And thank you again, as every year. Thank you for coming.